Welcome. I am Dallas Munkus. I'll be your MC host, sort of passing the baton around to our illustrious panel here. Just a brief introduction of myself. So I'm the National Practice Leader for Analytics and Modeling for Risk Management Solutions Group. We are a primarily regulatory focused consulting firm, but have started to do some analytic consulting as well. My background is all financial services on the lender side, on the credit bureau side, mostly in analytics for the last 25 years or so. Welcome to complaints as the canary in the coal mine for compliance, a webinar that we're excited to put on, and a topic that has played a large role in my history and maybe for the others coming in. So just a quick reminder, you can submit questions as this is going on if you have a question, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end where I'll select from some of those questions and let the panel answer. But without further ado, we'll get rolling. So I want to let the panel introduce themselves. Hannah, if you don't mind going first, just please introduce yourself to the folks on the webinar.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Hannah Turner. I am actually a consultant with a small boutique firm based out of Richmond, Virginia called Spinnaker Consulting Group. We work with Fortune 500 companies to solve various complex problems that they have in their operations. Heavy focus on financial services in areas like collections, regulatory findings, capacity management, kind of anything and everything. Prior to that, I spent about 18 years with Capital One, leading various projects, mostly in the business and operation analytics space, everything from fraud, collections, recoveries, call centers. I also managed both the banks and the credit cards complaint program. It was kind of there that I found my passion for customer experience. I've learned that there's a lot of really good information in both negative and positive customer feedback, and the better we listen to our customer, the better chance we have to wow them. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. Paul, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sounds great. Thanks, Hannah. So Paul Carlisle here, President of Advisory Services for RMSG. So Dallas and I are colleagues. Prior to RMSG, I was actually a safety and soundness examiner with the FDIC, and then one of the first compliance examiners during Dodd-Frank when that came about with the CFPB. So after my time as an examiner, I actually spent some time working for two major consultancies, Promontory Financial Group and Grant Thornton. And really what I helped them do there is just develop their risk management practice. From there, I spent some time in industry with a large bank. I headed up their UDAP sales practice and complaints team in the second line of defense. And then after my time in industry, we kind of got together as a group and started RMSG. This was around January of 21. So we're going on 3 years now. Really, our mission is just to do things a little bit differently than your typical consultant, where we introduce transparency and economical price points where they didn't consistently exist in the industry before. So good to be with everybody today. Scott?
Hey, everybody. Scott Hamilton. I'm currently with Prodigal Technologies, the host of today's podcast, or co-host. My background is I have about 30 years with GE Capital, Bank of America, Chase, and Capital One, and a couple years in consulting and a couple years with Prodigal. The theme is really led various transformation efforts, most of which in call centers. Both in origination, servicing, collections, and I definitely, like Hannah, in many roles, you often find yourself looping back to complaints because it's where so many things show themselves. Anything from NPS issues to compliance issues. It's a phenomenal. It's a gold mine, but it's just very, very tough gold mine to mine. So. I think we'll learn a little bit more today about how to do exactly that.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for the introductions, and thanks for taking the time to be here and lend your expertise to this topic. Now I think we'll turn and we'll actually talk about the complaints that folks have mentioned. So, Hannah, again, would you get us started by talking through some of the headwinds that you've seen in financial services, and particularly concerning sort of capturing, resolving, reporting, and ultimately making changes based on complaints?
Absolutely. So I kind of alluded to, I've spent time in complaints, both from the bank side and the credit card side. I had to actually stand up a program in bank. And when we started doing it in retail bank, we started both looking to listen to both negative and positive feedback. So it wasn't just a complaints program we stood up. We tried to listen through everything to hear the good and the bad and really try and take insight from that information. And it was there that I really started to get exposed to programs across the industry and from there got even more experience over the years going into the credit card side of the complaints program, and then also seeing some through my consulting days. And there's kind of 6 things that I think cause the biggest challenges in managing and standing up a complaints program in the financial services area. The first being just around setting a definition. Sounds easy, but really defining what a complaint is hard work, because there's everybody listens to something and hears something slightly different from each other. And if you don't have a consistent agreement on what a complaint is, you're going to have a lot of noise in the data you collect. So getting to that clear, consistent definition is key. And one of the ways I feel like I got better at that was by actually taking interactions and everybody agreeing, yeah, that's a complaint and that's not a complaint. And then using those as examples when we went into training agents and when we went into kind of discussions about it. It was easier to have those examples than just, a word definition of what a complaint is. So that leads me to the second interesting or challenging area, which is training your agents. So now you have a good definition. You hopefully have some good examples of what it is and isn't to share with them. But training agents is hard because they're trained to do so many different things and they have so many other things that they're worried about on phone calls. So it's just one more thing you're adding to their box. So how do you make it simple? How do you make it easy? How do you change their tools to help them with that? So how do you make it, so that they are thinking, oh, this is a complaint and I need to do something about it, even if it's just to tag a box. And so how do you have the tools help them do that better? And really, this is where automation can be a huge help, right? We want our agents, when they're on the phone with the customers, to be focused on our customers, not worried about ticking boxes and checking marks on screens. So, if you can get into automation where they can actually listen to the calls and tag it afterwards and add information, that's a great way to get past the training. But a lot of us can't go there right out of the gate. So you got to make it simple, make it a simple box they check. And if you're going to ask them for any kind of tagging on what kind of complaint it is, make sure there's only 6 to 8 things to choose from. Because my time in a call center, I can tell you, if there's a long list, they're going to revert to the first 2 things on the list. And that's what they're going to check as the reason, because they just are trying to get through the screen to take care of the customer, which is really their job, right? So that's, kind of the capture piece. From there, I think the next challenge is you've got all this data coming in from various sources. You've got to bring it together so that you can model it. So you got to aggregate it and then model it. And the challenge here is you've got to think about how you actually want to structure that data. So I've seen people just jump in and start building text models with no kind of notion on how they want it to all align. So, what's the hierarchy you want? Do you want it aligned to your business organization? Do you want it aligned to your products? Do you want it aligned to the different kind of types of complaints you have out there? And what's that hierarchy? So are you going to have a hierarchy that starts with fees and then goes down into the various types of fees that you're going to hear your customers complain about? Or do you want it to all be in the product area and kind of trickle down from there? I personally like the idea of going from a complaint type because I think it's a cleaner break. A lot of times you don't even know what product you're dealing with when the customer's complaining. So think about how you're getting that information as you build that hierarchy. And then obviously you're going to go build the model. And from there, this is where I think bringing in leadership so you can gain that buy-in is so important. And so that's kind of my next pitfall is getting that buy-in. And if you don't start it early, if you don't start it with the model itself, it can be really hard. So what we would do is we would get representatives from everywhere across the organization to help us build the model. And their job was to look at what we were tagging, how we were looking at each of the interactions and saying, okay, this is a complaint about, do you agree? And if not, tell us why. And so they were a part of that process of building the model, refining the model, and getting it to tag the way we all thought it should tag. And so that got them really, kind of vested in the model, right? If people feel ownership for the model, they don't want the model to mess up because then they probably were part of the problem and were, doing their job and making sure the model is doing it. So that was kind of our first big way of getting buy-in. And then, next we demonstrated to them that we were always going to have that that feedback loop. We knew that complaints would change. Language changes, right? The way people talk to us change. Our product names change. Their complaints change. And so, we needed to demonstrate to them there be that continual feedback loop, that way for them to keep adding things to the model or keep helping us refine the model. And so that was another way we gained their trust, was by having that as a part of that conversation. And just kind of a side note, this is a great place to bring in some machine learning, right? Machine learning is great at helping you refine things. If you can go in and say, hey, you're tagging this as this, but we actually need it to be that, the model can help you rebuild that. And so you're not always having to go in there and manually update the model. So now we've got all this wonderful data, right? It's tagged, it's clean, it's all in one place, everybody's happy. No. Now we got to actually see, how do we get information into the hands of the people out there so that they can take action and do something with it? So we got to build some really cool reporting around it. And I'm not talking about stagnant reporting. Like, it needs to be highly interactive, and you need to be able to go in there and see things from the very top of the house all the way down to that singular complaint. You have to be able to go in and read the transcripts and see the letters, or at least know how to get to them if you can't have them inside the tool. And sometimes you can't. It's just too much data. It's too big. It's too cumbersome. But at least if you have account numbers and ways to point them to other places, they can go and dig into it. And you need to have really good analysis around what's trending, and not just about what's going up, but what sentiment is getting worse. What are new things that never used to pop before? So we never used to hear words around a certain spokesperson who joined the company as a spokesperson, and all of a sudden his name or her name is popping. Like, your model needs to pick up on that so you can help bring attention to, hey, this is something we haven't seen before, but it's happening. Why is it happening? How do you bring attention to that in the reporting? And one thing we did, which was maybe a little on edge, was we actually would do reporting by the executive's name. So an executive come in and see at a high level, this is what the company is doing. And then you could see how each of the executives' areas were doing. And they could run reporting on just their stuff. So it made it easy for them to get to what mattered to them quickly without having to, choose different drop downs or filter on certain keywords. Now, you may not want to put people's names. Some people get a little touchy with that. But for us, it was a really good way to kind of create accountability and visibility. You may want to be a little more gentle. I don't know. You do it based on how your organization works. I'm a little bit more of an in-your-face kind of gal, so I like the names. But, that was really important, because now people felt ownership for the information in that report. And then the last piece of the puzzle, I think, is really actually driving action. We didn't do all this just to collect data. I mean, sometimes we do, because let's face it, the regulators want the data. And so that was kind of the first checkbox, was get the data. But, what they really want us to do with that is to drive change. And so how do we drive change in that reporting? And a lot of that has come through all the stuff we did before, right? We've hopefully got buy-in. We've hopefully got them good reporting that they can feel comfortable, that they know what's going on and where to act. But it's our job to help highlight some of those things. Again, we're showing that in the trends. We're showing that in what's emerging. But we can also do things like help highlight, how does this maybe relate to another program that's out there already? How can we take some of these complaints and use it to drive change in what we're already spending resources on, right? And so it's a way to use resources that have already been allocated elsewhere to drive change in something that's driving complaints. And we've got to show them the value. We've got to show them, hey, there are a lot of complaints out there, and that's impacting your business. And if we don't bring those volumes down, we're doing ourselves a disservice. So it's helping just bring that visibility out there to motivate people to want to make a change. So those are kind of my 6 hot areas. I will say this: when it's done well, things become so much easier. Regulators come in and they say, hey, I want your last 2 years of data. Great. Run a report. Put in a date range. You want it on SCRA? Great. I'll filter out just the SCRA stuff we've heard for the last 2 years. It makes it so much easier. And the regulators love it, because they can look under the hood and see exactly how everything works, because you've got these models that are consistently tagging things. They're extremely transparent. All the reporting's out there. They can touch and see it all. And they feel like, okay, you're not just, pulling data once in a blue moon because we're here asking for it. You're doing it on a regular basis. So those are kind of my thoughts on how an organization should think about their complaints program. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, I think it definitely was, Hannah, and I appreciate the perspective. I mean, I've experienced some of the same struggles in my previous roles. I think you hit on some important points: gaining buy-in from both executives, making life easy on your frontline call center staff. I mean, I know at one point we were looking at an organization, and the customer service reps on the front line were using 6 or 7 different systems, so they were always sort of navigating about. So yeah, introducing another one for complaints can be tough. So no, I appreciate the perspective. And you also sort of tied it to the regulators, right? Checking that box was first. So Paul, I think we'll go to you next. I'm interested to hear, your perspective. I think like many things these days, complaints are becoming a hotter and hotter hot button for regulators. So can you just talk to us about how, the focus and expectations around complaints seems to be increasing?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dallas. So, as a former regulator, I'm here to kind of provide that perspective, and I like to say that I'm reformed. Right, it's been a bit since I've been out of it. I'm fighting the good fight on all of your sides. So, just to give you a bit of that regulatory perspective and why it's important. So, obviously, I'm not exactly breaking any news here, but it's no question complaints are a focal point of regulators. Right, they have been for years. It was heightened by Dodd-Frank and the CFPB, and the regulators expect institutions to, properly identify, track, and resolve consumer complaints. And why is that really important? Well, as Hannah alluded to, complaints tell a story, and they serve as your window to the consumer and their experiences with your institution. So as this webinar title would suggest, complaints are really the canary in the coal mine, and they often give you the first indication that anything is wrong with a particular area, product, service, process, whatever it may be. That is if you're properly equipped to listen to that feedback and appropriately respond to the consumer complaint, right? And so I did like Hannah's point about kind of considering this more as a feedback, taking the good and the bad. I think there's lessons that could be learned on both sides of the fence. But at minimum, speaking from the regulatory lens or inside of the fence, at minimum we're expecting to at least manage the negative. So I'm going to throw a few facts and figures at you here. Hopefully not too many, but for example, in the CFPB's most recent, it came out on March 23. Consumer Response annual report. It comes from their division of Consumer Response. That's essentially their complaint team. The top 5 complaint categories that they identified in 2022 were around creditor consumer reporting, debt collection, credit card, checking your savings, and mortgage. And creditor consumer reporting is probably not a big surprise to folks on this call, checked in by a large margin at over the other categories. They came in at around 76% of all CFPB 2022 complaints. 94% of which the complainant reported that they first attempted to resolve their issue with the company before going to the CFPB. So a majority of these creditor consumer reporting complaints were also closed with explanation or closed with non-monetary relief, which is consistent with a broader response across all the complaint categories. I think it's upwards of 61%, so certainly over a majority for all categories where it fit those 2 buckets. Only 2% of all 2022 complaints were closed with monetary relief. So there's a pretty stark difference there, right? And so I know there's a lot of percentages and numbers that I'm throwing at you, but I think what the percentages show here, it supports the notion of having the ability to listen, capture, and appropriately respond to the consumer when there's a problem is really the bulk of this. It's the bulk of the complaint program. And relief doesn't necessarily have to include a monetary component or a larger issue. It just could mean simply clarification, right? So you're going to want to have that channel to communicate with your customers. And so as such, it's critical you have an effective complaint management program to address these complaints when the customer first makes you aware. A significant part of that process is training, tools available, and personnel to identify and log a true complaint. So you really want to kind of tighten up those areas to be able to actually receive the feedback. And so what does a good complaint management program look like from a regulatory perspective? So I'm sure everyone on this call already has something established, some form of a complaint management program within their institution. Whether it's an ultra sophisticated or fancy system doesn't so much matter as whether it's right size for your institution. Does it work for you and your customers? Believe it or not, some of our clients are still managing complaints in an Excel spreadsheet or a simple access database. So depending on the institution, I'd probably say that's not the most sustainable solution, but some are able to make it work, and it could work for them or you, depending on your size shop. So at a high level, a successful complaint management program typically includes some form of the following core components. So number 1, formal complaint program, policies, and procedures, right? So that's where you're going to define your complaint, as Hannah alluded to, establish your roles and responsibilities, and set the expectation for what you do and how you intend to do it. So this is typically where you'll get into the specifics on how you manage complaints through the complaint lifecycle, such as complaint intake channels or methods, how you handle the complaint through resolution, escalating complaints, and dealing with high-risk complaints, complaint data analysis, complaint training, and complaint reporting. So number 2 is establishing a system of record to manage complaints throughout the lifecycle. So in other words, just really having somewhere for the data to live and somewhere you can store it that's accessible and retrievable. 3, developing training. So it's very critical to train your personnel on what to look out for and what meets the definition of a complaint and how they should react and what specifically they need to do when they receive a complaint. Everyone really needs to be on the same page with that process so it can function as intended. And so the last one here, managing the complaint and leveraging the complaint data. So this includes intake and how you track, escalate, identify root cause and trends, resolve and report out on complaints. Regulators are really looking for, as Hannah alluded to before, regulators are looking for specific instances of where you've leveraged that complaint data and made adjustments to bank practices based on what you're learning from customers. And then finally, what's the regulatory perspective on complaint technology solutions? So believe it or not, regulators are not anti-technology. In fact, they understand and appreciate efficiencies that can be gained by leveraging these reg tech tools. They're actually open to new ideas and approaches to managing complaints, provided you really need to prove to them that it works, right? And that's right for your institution and your situation. So regardless of the system or process you use, ultimately, you need to prove it provides you with the complaint data that can be trusted and it's accurate and reliable, right? I mean, good data is what everybody's after here. So with respect to previous system criticisms and data challenges, right? So I'll keep it pretty brief here so as to not steal too much of Scott's thunder, and he's going to walk you through the Prodigal piece of this. But from having seen a number of these early systems in action, and I'm not going to disparage any particular product or service or company that's already out there, but a lot of these weren't ready for prime time, in my view. So in some cases, they leveraged limited machine learning or rudimentary automation, but required a lot of manual calibration and upkeep to even get close to being functional. And so even once you felt like you were in a pretty good spot with the design and you flipped the switch to turn it on, you typically would just bury you in false positives or negatives requiring review. I'm sure many of you on this call are experienced with that, where you spend more time essentially rooting through the noise. And so it puts pressure on your limited staff to perform the activities and really adds little to no value to the complaint management operation and just kind of muddies the water with respect to what's truly important. So as Scott will get into, Prodigal has taken these lessons learned to integrate AI, which has helped revolutionize the process to make complaint management easier and more accurate and reliable for its clients. And really embracing the right AI solutions can help set you apart from your competitors and show your consumers you're listening to them. Dallas?
All right. Well, thanks for weighing in on the regulatory aspect, Paul. I think you did a pretty good job sort of shifting it over to Scott, but I'll take the alley-oop. So Scott, can, as Paul was mentioning, would you mind, hey, walk us through, in your history in the complaint space and as you walk through in your intro, what technologies, what types of things have you seen that worked or didn't work, and what's coming, on the horizon in the complaint space that will meet the needs and sort of help overcome some of the obstacles that Hannah was walking us through and satisfy the regulatory aspects that Paul mentioned.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it. And Paul, checks in the mail for being a great wingman. So in terms of what I know is going on in the industry, I'll touch on some of the processes and tools that some of the larger banks are using, what they've learned, and sort of what the consensus is on going forward. So generally, every bank that I've worked for or with or heard about or talked with, large and small, have some sort of a process. Most have historically used, in the call center channel, there's like 8 different ways you can probably gather a complaint, but specifically in the call center or email and text channel, generally banks have used, it's a transcription tool, right? Where it converts a voice to a text, and then you tell the tool what words to go look for. And it's an if-then query tool. You look for I'm mad, I want to talk to your manager, swearing, whatever it is you brainstorm to put into this tool, it will generally find it. The transcriptions themselves aren't great, but it'll find what you tell it to look for. The issue is it won't find what you don't tell it to look for, false negatives. And then half the stuff that it does find, the context around it, they're complaining about the dog that's in the room, not about the product or service that they're getting. So false positives. So I'm surprised at how many banks are actually at the point where, to Paul's earlier point, they've gotten to the point where the false positives and false negatives are so high that the definition of complaint bar is rising at the same time, that they're finding that these tools are just inadequate. Actually, they're being told through compliance or audit or regulators that their first line detection controls are inadequate. And in many cases, they're either being forced to remove their capabilities or they're opting to remove them, simply because, to Paul's point, the false positives and negatives. There are 2 banks that I know of in the top 10 that have all the way gone back to the basics. They're 100% reliant on the agent themselves forming a judgment call on every call, self-declaring, self-documenting, to Hannah's point, self-categorizing every complaint that they think happened. And they submit it to some case management system in the back office, and it's a manual process. So it's incredible that a lot of these tools were originally built to solve part of this problem, to Paul's point, but were sort of helpful, but became a false sense of security. Now, as we shift to the future, the good news is there's a consensus that, to Hannah's point, machine learning models are finally getting to the point where they're accurate enough to be able to help in this space. That's why, not surprisingly, I joined Prodigal for specifically this reason, to be honest. It really gets down to the models being so accurate and so trained on exactly this type of conversation that they're actually better than a human. Not just like reasonably good, but actually better than if you had the same human doing it hundreds of millions of times. It's actually better than that. So the models do exist. They can interpret the conversation, the context of the conversation, and can truly identify whether a complaint occurred. It can summarize the complaint. It can categorize the complaint. And to Hannah's 6-step process, everything down the line is that much cleaner and faster and more actionable. So it's an exciting time. It's the tool that I wish I had when I was in previous roles, and that's where I see most of the banks playing, and where I see some banks already starting to go from a machine learning standpoint.
Okay. Well, yeah, very cool stuff. Appreciate you sharing your expertise. We do have some questions in the chat, so we can start to walk through those. I think one of the interesting ones that I'll maybe just sort of toss up to the panel and let you guys maybe each speak on it is, complaints as a part of third parties and in the context of third-party risk management. And I think there's a couple of aspects that we could chat about there. One of which is if a consumer complains directly to you about one of your third parties. I think the other piece of that is complaints that might go to those third parties to which you may or may not have knowledge of, or at least in some situations you may not. So if one of you guys wouldn't mind starting and talk about that maybe from both of those perspectives.
I can give 2 seconds. I'll give a short, and it looks like everybody could probably chime in. One thing that I'll share is when you do get to levels of automation, you can apply those same models to multiple audiences. In the case of third parties, you can bring in their email, their text, their audio conversations, and put them in the same models that you use internally. Additionally, your first, second, and line and audit teams all use the same models as well, and you don't have first, second, third line debates as to whether something was a complaint or not. And this internal thumb wrestling match, or maybe you have a thumb wrestling match with the agency, uses a different definition of complaint. When you start to get to the automation, one of the peripheral benefits is you can start using one definition, one model that everybody gets the output of, and you stop sort of having opinions as to whether something was a complaint that varies from someone else's opinion.
Very cool. Paul or Hannah, you want to weigh in on third parties?
I mean, I could hop in and provide that regulatory perspective. I think we all know that there's enough guidance out there across all the agencies that largely similar, at least shares a lot of similarities, and they're pretty much saying a lot of the same things. So third-party risk management is obviously big within that, and complaints as a sort of subcategory within the third-party risk management overall is huge, right? And so, clients of ours typically wrestle with being a big enough player sometimes to sway the third party to act, or, you're not their biggest fish or customer. So, when it comes to getting the complaint definition, right, it's, do we feel comfortable with the third party using what it considers to be a complaint and passing that along to us? Or do we want to give them our definition, have them sort of follow that, but then they're working with other customers and they may sort of mix that up. I mean, the general thought is you have to sort of establish a mechanism to receive that data, much like you would any other complaint. Treat it as if your own. You can outsource the function to the third party, but you can't outsource the risk. So if there's a risk buried in there, you want to know about it.
Yeah, I think of it just as another data source, and we have to figure out how to get to that data and how to bring it in and how to treat it just like we would like a social media post or a handwritten letter that's emailed, sent into the company too. So, it's all, to me, just another data source, and we have to figure out how do we get access to it so we can bring it in and model it in the same way.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, it's like streams of information, right? So, hey, we have them coming from these various internals, but you need them coming from your third parties as well to make sure that you're covered, because, to Paul's point, the expectation is their complaints are your complaints.
You're still my customer.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. Awesome. So another question came in, and I think this one, Hannah, if you don't mind taking it first, and then Scott would be interested in your thoughts here as well, but around, particularly maybe diving one layer deeper about how do you identify regulatory related complaints? Like, how do the models understand that the complaint might be in that regulatory bucket?
Yeah. And we actually model for that. So I mentioned SCRA earlier today. Like, we actually look for those words in any of the transcripts and any of the data sets we run, right? So we're looking for things that might highlight that this is an SCRA related or a Reg E or a Reg Z. So we actually write code to look for those particular things. And we have actually run, and there's kind of two schools of thought here, and I've done it both ways, and there's pros and cons of both. We've run models that are strictly looking for regulatory complaints outside of just kind of the general complaint pool, and we've tried to integrate them together. There's pros and cons to both, but either way, you should be looking for those things. It's just another set of eyes, right? We've got all this great data. Why wouldn't we mine it to find it? I'd rather find my regulatory problems before a regulator does. And so, it's just, to me, again, just another way of kind of covering my back.
Just to bolt on to that, complaints, I think the new definition that most of the banks are starting to comply with is any sense of dissatisfaction. I know one top 5 bank just went from one definition to that, and they're expecting their volumes to jump tenfold, which I about fell out of my chair on that one. But whether something's a complaint or not is one challenge, but to understand what type of complaint, or heaven forbid, you'd have to map it to a reg or map it to a root cause Like all those types of things are sort of the tier two. They're incredibly difficult yet needed and powerful. And again, from Prodigal's perspective, using machine learning models allows you to take the way they're set up. You take historically mapped complaints to certain regs. The models can learn from that history and apply it to the future. So to your SCRA example, Hannah, if they say I'm being deployed, that one's the easy one. But if they say, my new boss is having me leave for the Middle East next week, and I'm not going to be back for 6 months. They never said deployed, but they meant it. And those are the types of things where the machine learning models can pick up on that stuff, and be able to help categorize things to regs. It's not super easy to do, but that's the power of where these tools can get.
Well, and I think a place we haven't gone yet is thinking about how do we then take this data and marry it to all our other data, right? So we know, sometimes we already know who our service members are, right? But it's not in the complaint data because it wasn't in that conversation, but we have it in the system. So how do you marry those data sets together? And I don't think a lot of companies have gotten here yet. I mean, this is a big battle in and of itself, but in the future, we should be able to get all the data talking together, and so we can actually look at account activity. We can look at account information on our customers and start marrying all that and actually start to get even deeper into all of this stuff. It's a lot of data and it's a lot of work. It's going to take us time to get there, but it's all possible.
Yeah, that's sort of where my mind went when he was chatting as well. Is okay, if I know the employer, or if I have a deposit relationship with this person and I see a direct deposit come in, once a month or every couple of weeks, then how am I able to layer that data on top of what I'm hearing and what I know to know, hey, if they say my boss is sending me out of town for 6 months, and I see that they're employed by the U.S. Navy, well, guess what? We're gonna, we'll consider that a deployment.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things. I think one other thing, and Hannah, maybe I'll start with you, that is interesting is, so you sort of talked about the process of capturing and all of that, but sometimes complaints are driven sort of outside of that, right? Like we talk about, our processes, and hey, to make sure that our processes are followed, we need to do training. And then I don't know if you've experienced this, but I've seen situations where you do training, people are more adherent to your policy, and so your complaints actually increase. Because the problem isn't necessarily the activities of the frontline staff, but the policy itself and what things that you're making the consumer do. So I think that ties back to sort of root cause. And Scott, I think you mentioned it, but can you talk about how having this data, having that buy-in that you mentioned, makes it easier to sort of uncover what that root cause is?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it becomes a partnership of everybody of trying to understand what's creating a complaint, right? It's not just the complaint team's job to find all these complaints, understand what's driving all these complaints, and get all to the root cause. It's everybody's job, and I think of the complaints team as a way to start the game, right? It's the way to start with, hey, here's a bunch of stuff I think we need to dig into, do some of that preliminary digging, and then bringing in all those people who really have the expertise in whatever area it is. Because if you think about it, anything in the company can be complained about. I'm not going to be an expert in everything. That's not my forte. But there are other people who are. So how do you bring in all those players to really dig into what's causing that? And so I think of it as it being the starting point, the impetus, but it becomes everybody else's game as well. Yeah,
it really is a team sport, and not you can't be like, oh, complaints are something that they do or they handle.
Dallas, one thing to toss in that I have seen a couple banks get into is when you can capture the complaints, structure them in a way at scale and accurately, is linking it to other data. For example, they went into Target and the card got declined. Then they called in and they complained about their credit limit or the check deposit availability speed or something, but never the two got connected. And everybody knows that the card got complained. That's easy to know, but understanding why they complained has always been an unstructured conversational data set. And if you can use models, again, I'm talking my book here, but if you can use models to take unstructured data, convert it to structured data, they're calling about their funds availability policy or timing, and link it to other structured data, the card got declined, it allows the path to researching root cause really get faster. So anyway, I've seen a couple banks start to do that, which is super exciting.
Okay. So next question, I'll put in my own words, but so Paul, if you had to pull out your crystal ball and say, you know, where is regulatory sentiment on complaints heading in the future, so call it the next 12 to maybe 24 months, what do you see coming down or changing, or sort of having the additional emphasis from the regulators coming into banks?
Yeah, I mean, I think the fundamental expectations around, you know, what is a complaint management program from a regulatory perspective, I don't see a lot of that changing. I mean, it's still the blocking and tackling, right? You've got to have a means to pull in that feedback, that information, resolve the concern, and keep sort of tabs on root causes and trends, and really just show and demonstrate that you're aware of the information and correct the pervasive issues that you're seeing around the bank. You know, the biggest thing I think that's changed, at least in my view, are some of these tech solutions, these reg tech solutions that I mentioned before, becoming more sophisticated and available, models becoming more accurate, AI being introduced in the equation that can, to Scott's point, learn based on previous experiences, to his point, better than a human, right? It's kind of scary for us humans on the call, but I think that's where it's headed, right? And I think the folks that get on board with some of those, and keep in mind, it's no silver bullet, right? There's it's a tool in the belt. For now, you're still going to have that analytical component that a person is going to have to come in and review that. But I think, you know, where I see it going from here is really just continued efforts in the industry to support, you know, the ability of all this data that's available, and honing that data accuracy, leading to more, you know, sort of better, more refined results to facilitate more timely response.
Yeah, and Scott, I think the next question is for you. So, I mean, I'm a data nerd. So, any sort of statistics or talking points, or even representative examples on sort of the increase in accuracy and or efficiency from, you know, sort of removing the impetus from your frontline staff to more of an automated, you know, passive model approach?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, a couple of statistics. Generally, I think agents, especially distributed agent populations, call it your QA organization in your 1.5 line or second, or thousands of agents on your front line. If they can yield the same output 85% of the time, the same complaint gets yes and no'd at this 85% of the time. That's generally where a human performs. So relative to machine learning models, and we've had this conversation actually, Paul, with your alma mater at the CFPB, when you can deliver north of 90, you'll never get to 100. But when you get north of 90% accuracy, it really opens up all sorts of things. We happen to be talking about complaints today, but you can get into QA automation, you can get to call reasons, you can get into call reason codes that drive your digital strategy, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, it's in the north of the 90 standpoint, and the models are there. The tough part is training the models to get there, and that has to be done with millions and millions of bad decisions that get told to the model what the right decision is so they can learn. So to Paul's point, even though you can automate a lot of this, you still do need to have a human component that QAs or validates or invalidates the output, so the model can either be validated or get smarter over time. So I don't know if that helps, Dallas, but that's where the models are and need to stay in order for the regulators to say, you're not just 50 or 60%. You're better than a human, and we've got a process to prove it.
Excellent. Yeah, and not that adhering to regulations or treating your customers right isn't enough of a impetus for folks to pursue this or to pursue getting better at this. Anything that or sort of feedback that you've heard from that the frontline staff or call it first line or second line of defense, just in sort of engagement or satisfaction from removing some of this or automating some of these tasks off of their plate?
Yeah, if that's for me, that I've seen banks do one of two things. Either when employing these models, they either all of them start with putting the models in sort of 1.5 or second line as a challenger detective control against their existing process, and they do that to validate the models are right. Some banks do one of two things after that point. They either leave them there and actually start to tell their agents to not capture complaints anymore. Like we have it on the back end, we'll validate it on the back end. Nobody's actually gotten to that point, but that's where they're planning to go. Path 2 is they do that in second line and 1.5 line. But they also arm the agents with more real-time versions of this solution where it'll detect that a complaint occurred and will provide in-call prompts to the agent to help de-escalate and remediate. And then also allows them to document the complaint and apply a type and subtype, and sort of better arms the agent to learn in the moment that a complaint occurred and how to de-escalate and categorize it themselves. So I've seen both strategies employed.
Yeah, I've seen them actually play with it too, with a way to notify a manager. So if I have a call and it's going south, my manager can see that I might be in a tough call and have that ability for that manager to help me out so that the call maybe gets resolved with me before it gets escalated. We tested that in a couple of places in different ways. It's a hard, so it's still a technology hurdle, but I've seen people dabble in that space.
Yeah, and I like that because, at least, again, in my past, besides sort of, or at least around the process side, one of the biggest drivers for, for complaints or just maybe less complaints, but more sort of customer dissatisfaction is the lack of being able to resolve an issue in one call, right? So that one call resolution, if you worked in call centers enough, you hear it all the time. And so, yeah, if we can get someone to come in and help before that customer hangs up, calls again, gets back in the queue, waits, and then comes in hot for the next person that they talk to, that's a win.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. So next question that came in. So, if a complaint is resolved during a call, so, if the customer sort of leaves happy, would you still advise capturing that as a complaint? I think the answer to that is yes, but can you guys chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, it absolutely is. There was still an issue that brought them in, and even though we could resolve it, we shouldn't have had the issue, right? At the end of the day, the outcome that you want as a company, at least in my opinion, is you don't want to cause any issues for your customers. It should be a seamless, easy interaction. So if you're still creating things that cause tension for your customers, it's still a complaint. Whether or not I took care of it in a phone call, doesn't matter. They shouldn't have had to call. This shouldn't have happened.
Right. And you could see a situation where, especially for a larger organization, that happens 1,000, 1,500, 2,500 times a month. And if it's not captured, then you don't know, oh, hey, there's really a problem with something we're putting on our statements, or there's really a problem with this advertising campaign that we did, or there, like, yeah, without that information, you can't dig in and find that root cause. So
Exactly.
I feel like you have to include it. You have to count it.
And I think that's, goes back to something Scott said earlier of like, complaint volume shouldn't terrify you. It's going to go up. When you start doing this well, you're going to see more complaints. And you're not seeing more complaints because all of a sudden people are complaining more. You're seeing more complaints because now you can see them and you can identify them. That's not a bad thing. That's just more data. And maybe that's because I'm an analyst and, more data is never bad in my book. But, at the end of the day, I'd rather know what's going on because then I can do something to make it better. If I don't know, I can't change.
Yeah, I feel like complaints are like your health care, right? Ignorance is not bliss when it comes to your health or complaints.
Fair enough.
What I would add to that too, in terms of the positive sentiment, right? We touched on this a little bit before, where you can learn a lot from even the things that are quote unquote inquiries, right? It doesn't have to be necessarily negative feedback. Where if you have a mechanism to capture even some of the other more standardized feedback you receive, you can still identify areas within the bank that you can improve, right? So some of these tools will allow you to go down that road too, like unlike before, where you're having people kind of make these judgment calls on their own. And is this a complaint? Is it not a complaint? At the end of the day, does it always matter, right? I mean, of course you want to get your complaints, right? But the idea here is risk mitigation, and not you'll never be perfect. You're in a risk making and taking function and field. And so to Scott's point, right, if you can get to a 90% success rate, I mean, you're doing pretty well.
Yeah, I'll actually add on to that. My favorite program was when I listened to it all, because it also allowed me to put them next to each other. I could look at the same thing and see what people liked about it and what people didn't like about it. I could also see kind of the full spectrum. And so I feel like, in my world, I'd love to go to the place where we listen to everything and have a way to score it all on sentiment and all on categorizations and really see kind of what is truly hot topics and really affecting, the masses, both good and bad. But, that's a pipe dream perhaps at this moment.
No, it's not.
There you go. There you go.
Well, interesting, just on that, one bank complaints was a subset. Just understanding why people are calling, this is a call center, is actually really, really hard to do manually at scale accurately. But it is the prerequisite to then map to complaints. It's a prerequisite to figure out if your IVR is working, what product features they really like that are just coming out. Like it really does. The cousin of this same webinar is just call reason codes, is just incredibly valuable. Sentiment is obviously a core component as well.
One of the things too, if I could hop in, just a little pro tip, right, from a former regulator. So one of the things, and we touched on this just a moment ago, where I would come in and I would sit down and say, what does your complaint data look like? How many complaints you're receiving? Give me some reporting. And about the worst answer you could give is, well, we don't really get that many complaints. And then that leads you into a whole sort of litany of other questions where you're probing into this complaint management program and you're starting to sort of decrease your ability to sell your function to the regulator, right? And so just kind of keep that in mind when working with them. Just that's a red flag.
Yep. All right. Well, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Once again, thank you, Scott, Hannah, Paul, for jumping on and lending your expertise. To those who are attending, thank you. We certainly appreciate your attendance. We'll follow up with an email and a recording in case you want to revisit anything here, in case there are others inside your organization that would benefit from this discussion. As far as resources on complaints go, I think, Scott, you can reach out to prodigaltech.com if you want to learn more about some of the tech that Scott mentioned. Feel free to reach out to Paul if you have questions on RMSG or need some help understanding or navigating the regulatory landscape of complaints or really any other regulatory topic in your organization. We'll include the contact information for these folks in the forthcoming email as well. And, again, I hope everyone have a great day, and thanks for attending.